Welcome to You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. You are ambitious in life and in your career, but something is missing. You want to bring more of your passion to what you do. Because let's be honest, you pour a ton into your work, and it needs to mean more. I'm your host, Laura Eigel. I'm a mom, wife, PhD, coach, advocate, introvert, and indoor rowing fanatic. I'm passionate about living a life that's in line with my values. We'll give you the actionable tips and tools you need to lead with your values, make a difference, and have career success. The world needs more diversity and authenticity in the top jobs at organizations. Your leadership belongs there. You belong in the C-Suite. What gets you up in the morning? What drives your decisions? What do you stand for? No idea, not even sure where to start? I use my values to guide my life and career. It's the basis of how I've built boundaries for myself and stuck to them. Are you ready to dig into what matters to you? Go to thecatchgroup.com to download your free values worksheet. That's thecatchgroup.com to download your free values worksheet to get to your core values and take action on what matters most. Welcome to this week's episode of the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. Often I get podcast and resource ideas from themes that I see across coaching clients or through the work that I do with leaders and teams within organizations. I love building resources, worksheets, or ways to think through a problem or solution that supports my clients. This episode and this series is an example of just that. Getting feedback from others and building a podcast series and resources around it to assist leaders to take action. Earlier this year, I held the first in-person retreat for the alumni of my You Belong in the C-Suite group coaching participants. Multiple leaders that I've worked with over the past few years within group coaching cohorts came together in Dallas for community building and to have intentional time to focus on their personal and leadership development. Within the retreat, I facilitated the Values First Leader Workshop, which highlights exercises from my book and workbook, Values First. So leaders spent time reflecting on their core values, what may have changed or evolved over time, and new insights that have come up for them. It was so motivating for me as their facilitator and coach to see these tools were still so relevant for these leaders, even after they had been through them before in group coaching. The tools were almost even more thought-provoking and timely for those in the room because they had evolved over time. As people, as leaders, they had evolved. They had grown. And by going through the Values First leader content, they were able to dig into a familiar framework, but utilize it within their new lens or their evolution, their growth. Some leaders were in new roles, some had started businesses or were leading even bigger teams. But wherever they were in their self-development, they all discovered new insights. Maybe their values had evolved and they had an aha because something was new and clarified what was more important to them now. While others found validation that their values had remained consistent and they had been making decisions with their values to make that happen. The big learning for me was that the Values First framework is powerful because you can use it as you grow and evolve. When I built it, that's the design I had in mind, but it was so powerful to see it at work in the room at the retreat and workshop. I mean, I've gotten to see the magic of it the first time people see it and interact with it in ways in leadership trainings and speaking engagements. But seeing it consistently work to support leaders through their growth over multiple years was really wonderful for me to see in person in action. So based on that, in this episode and this podcast series, I am going to challenge you to get reacquainted with the Values First framework and the most important exercises in my book, Values First. I was also inspired by a company that I'm partnering with to build this podcast series as a book club of sorts. I did a speaking engagement with a company, and their employee resource group decided to do a book club and are featuring Values First, which I'm so honored that they picked it for their book club. And so they're going to meet every month and talk about a section of the Values First framework each month. So this felt like the best time to build a book club discussion guide. I will tell you, a couple of people have asked me for it in the past, and I didn't have time to prioritize it, but I was able to do so. And so I'm really excited to do that. So that's what we're going to do in this series. Starting with this episode, we'll cover one section of the Values First framework each week. I'll give examples from clients and from my own experience on the most powerful exercises in the book, and I'm challenging you to follow along. And I know you'll get something out of it, whether you are new to this podcast and you have read the book already, or if you've never read it at all. I know that the Values First framework will evolve with you and meet you where you are. So, I want you to follow along with us each week and see what new insights or reminders that you resonate with most. I'm even going to give you a way to download the Values First book discussion guide. So make sure you wait until the end for info on how to do that. So in this episode, we'll start with a reminder of the steps of the Values First framework. Then we'll dig in to the first step of the framework. Let's listen to this clip from a previous podcast episode where I summarized the Values First framework just after the book was released in 2022. Let's listen. So today I'm going to dig into the Values First framework a bit more. The model itself at its core is simple because it grounds you in your values. At every step, your values are considered because that's what's most important to you. So who is this framework for? It's for everyone. You don't have to be a leader at a big company. You can still be in school or just starting your career. Or you can be a seasoned executive already in the C-suite or running your own company. It's a framework that meets you where you are. And the framework can be easily remembered because it is an acronym and it spells out the word values. The V stands for Values First. The A stands for audit time. The L is for life boundaries. The U is for uplifting others. The E is for experiencing conflict. And the S stands for sustaining values. I've been using a version of this framework for multiple years as I've been coaching leaders. At the time, it wasn't called the Values First framework, but it essentially had the same steps in it, just named differently. Through the book writing process, I did name it Values First and came up with different step names. And while we were editing the book, Lauren and I, we built the acronym around it. So it had been named the Values First framework, but Lauren and I had this very circular conversation one day about naming the steps of the framework. And we wanted it to start with a baseline of your values or clarity of values. And we went around and around with it until Lauren just looked at me and then at this flip chart and said, "Oh my goodness, what about this?" And for the step one, she simply wrote out Values First because that's what we start with. And that's the name of the framework. So obviously it has to be Values First. And that is a moment we still laugh about. So yes, the V stands for Values First because that's where I always want you to start, with your values. In the first part of the framework, you dig into what matters most to you to set that foundation of your core values. In episode 1 of this podcast, I talk about how to find clarity in your values by answering a few open-ended prompts and then identifying themes, which will lead you towards 5 to 7 values. In the free Values First workbook, you can download that worksheet. And then you identified what living your values means to you in the I'm Living My Values 1 worksheet. And I love both of these exercises as the kind of foundation of this framework because you get clarity on what's most important to you and you define it for yourself. What one person defines as success for a value of impact could be very different for another person's definition of that same value. The next stage of the Values First framework is very eye-opening. It's called audit time. There are exercises within this stage of the framework to see how you're spending your time, and then you overlay your values on top of that. So where are your values showing up? Where are they not? Which ones are most important to you right now? Lots of insights can be gained here. Some opportunities for growth and some opportunities to celebrate where you are already living your values day in and day out. The next part of the Values First framework is life boundaries. Here I teach you a 3-step process to build a boundary. Think of your boundaries as a hug that you put around your values. You're wrapping up those values and you're protecting them, you're nurturing them. You're doing that by setting boundaries, keeping them, and celebrating them. Through the book and through the Values First workbook, I teach you how to build a boundary by tying it to a value, building a system around it, and then celebrating your success. This is where it may feel tough or even unattainable on some days. You'll have so many objections to putting that boundary in place. But I'll tell you, most of these are internal objections, and you may be keeping yourself from the things you really need, no one else. In the book, I talk about how to outsmart those internal and external objections and tips and tools to build and keep your boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable or hard to enforce. Listen to episode 3 of this podcast called Burnout and Boundaries for more examples. The next step of the Values First framework is uplifting others. When you start building your boundaries and living your values, others will start to take notice. They'll see the behavior change. If you're leading a team, then they will see you model that behavior. And in the book, I talk about the importance of peers, both to motivate you, but also to keep you accountable. I talk about the importance of having a close group of peers. I call it your catch crew. Who is in your catch crew? You know, the people you go to first when you want to celebrate an awesome work presentation, or your work BFF that you complain about your boss to. In episode 29 of this podcast called Peer Accountability for Growth, you can learn more about why peers are so important. The other part about uplifting others is very actionable. And it's building a culture based on your values. That can be a very tactical thing like building a rewards and recognition program to celebrate team successes, or it could be more aspirational and motivational. But you're doing the work here to show up leading with your values, and that will motivate others to do the same. Within the Values First workbook, there are multiple exercises here to use with your team to co-create the culture you want to build together. The next part of the Values First framework is experiencing conflict. And conflict will inevitably come. It's not if, but when. It may be a conflict or tension between two of your existing values. It may be when your values aren't being met, or if your values are in conflict with the company that you work for. It could be after a tough situation of not upholding your boundaries. Whatever the conflict, you can go back to your values first. Center back in your values. Use those to understand what is contributing to the conflict. If it's a conflict due to boundaries, you can use different exercises like the red flags and traps worksheet in your Values First workbook. Or you might need to do an actor action review using a high-low exercise. In the book, I equip you with the tools you need to be prepared for conflict when it comes up and learn from it so that you can get better in the future. So you know that I'm not a one and done kind of person. I'm a continuous learner. And remember, some of my values are growth and development. So I built the framework with sustainability in mind. The last step of the process is called sustaining values. I teach you how to live your values for the long haul. And that means over time. The tools are meant to be used multiple times. So your values might change over time. They're going to evolve. One value might be more important in one season of life than in another. What success means for one value could change over time too. So I've built out an action plan for you here that you can use regularly to check in with your values and do that with your catch crew, to learn from each other, to be held accountable to each other, and to build the practice of self-reflection. And that is the Values First framework. Next, we are starting from the beginning. First things first, values first. Let's listen to this clip from the Values First audiobook on how you can clarify your values. What are your core values? Are they still the same? To help you do this, don't forget to download the free values workbook filled with over 50 pages of exercises before you dig in. Through my own experience and that of the countless leaders I'd worked with, I built the Values First framework. What exactly is a value? As defined, core values are principles or beliefs that a person or organization views as being of central importance. What a big question. What is of central importance to you? To support you in uncovering this big question, I created a guided worksheet. If you haven't downloaded it yet, go to thecatchgroup.com/valuesfirst to download your Values First workbook. The Values First framework starts with, you've guessed it, identifying your values. Go to your workbook to dig into what matters most to you using the Values worksheet. This exercise has 3 parts to it. 1. Use reflection questions to help gain clarity on your values. 2. Identify the core values that resonate most with you. 3. Identify your secondary values. It's a profoundly life-changing exercise and the core of living your life with your values first. So be sure to take time to do all 3 parts. It should take about 30 minutes. You've got this. Let's get started. First, to get clarity on your values, start by answering a few reflection prompts. Think about a time that you were at your best. What were you doing? Think about a time that you were really uncomfortable, a time something didn't sit right in your gut. What was that like? How did you feel? When I did this for myself, I wrote about being my best when I was building the capability of others, one leader at a time. Having them see the insight for themselves and begin to make progress on it filled me with a sense of purpose. I wrote about getting better as a coach, about building my own capability and figuring out exactly which question to ask that would lead to a path of self-discovery for the person I was coaching. I wrote about getting to know the business more through these leaders and connecting the dots. I wrote about seeing them work through a problem or having the confidence to ask for a job that they wanted or a raise that they deserved. I wrote about hearing them say no and making the right decisions for themselves and their families. That felt amazing, spending time looking at and defining when I was at my best. The second prompt involves looking at the opposing side, when I wasn't at my best. It seems a bit counterintuitive to look at a time that wasn't so great to figure out what you value. Why should I want to think about a time that wasn't that great? Susan David describes in her book, Emotional Agility, that our emotions are a sign of our values, what really matters to us. On Brené Brown's podcast, Dare to Lead, Susan described how feelings of anger often come up in situations where we feel rooted in something that we care about. Anger is the sign that a value might not be being met. By reflecting on a negative situation, you may uncover a connection to a value that is deeply important to you. In this discomfort, I found clarity. For the second question, I wrote about being unsettled in my role because I didn't have a next path for myself. It was an uncomfortable time in which I wasn't being challenged and I didn't see a way forward for me at the organization. I had accomplished what I wanted in the role, and if I stayed, then would I be learning anything? It would likely be more of the same. The next part of the exercise is to identify core values that resonate with you based on the answers to the 2 questions. Within the worksheet, there's a list of words for you to start from. Use the themes or feelings from the prompts to pick up to 7 words that represent your values. There isn't a magic number here, but I found when working with my clients that choosing more than 7 values begins to become overwhelming. Be choosy. Which values are most important to you? Don't worry if you can't find the perfect word. Feel free to add in words to describe your values. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is to cross out the ones that don't resonate first. I realized that by picking out feelings or words from the writing prompts, I could identify my descriptors more easily. For instance, when I wrote about when I was at my best, I was coaching others. Out of the list, I identified development. I love developing teams and leaders. When I wrote about not learning anything new in my role in the second prompt,
I realized that I really needed to be developed and challenged in a role. I identified growth as another value that resonated with me. I define this as my own growth. If I wasn't learning, I wasn't growing.
I hope this refresher or introduction to the Values First framework has been helpful. Take the 15 to 30 minutes to complete the values worksheet and gain clarity on your values. Better yet, grab a few friends or your team and do it together. This is a great team building activity. Grab a few copies of the book, share them with your team, and send them this podcast as the episode releases. Have your own team book club. Or utilize it like the company I'm partnering with and share it with your employee resource group leaders or human resources partners to host an internal book club. Then grab the free Values First book club discussion guide on our website at thecatchgroup.com/valuesfirst or in the link in the show notes. In the book club discussion guide, you'll get multiple questions that you can use to dive deeper into the exercises in the book for each section of the Values First framework. It can guide your facilitation and group discussions. I've built these tools to be easily scalable and actionable, and I really hope that you are able to take a small, actionable step to use your core values to get the life and career you want. Remember, your leadership belongs here. You belong in the C-suite. I want to thank you so much for listening to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. If you are enjoying this content, please remember to rate and review on Apple Podcasts. By leaving a review, you are helping others find this content. We will be featuring 5-star reviews on air in upcoming episodes. Editing and support for the podcast is done by S&E Podcast Management. To get more tips and tools to help you live a life guided by your values, go to thecatchgroup.com. Keep your boundaries and take care.